Hi, my name is Dr. Shane Evans. I teach at a small community college in southern Alabama, and this is a recording of a professional development talk that I gave back in November of 2018. It's called Practice in School. Now, I've been teaching at this community college for over 20 years, but I must confess that I am not a smart man. In fact, it's taken me a long time to get to this point in my teaching career where I sort of get a handle on things. And I have a spirit animal. Let me show you my spirit animal. Captain Obvious. It takes me a while to kind of figure things out. So this is from years of thought and experience of sort of what I come up with a conclusion about practice in school. Now, I'm in my mid-50s. I went to college back in the early 1980s, and I think most of my college career was spent in traditional college courses, where there was a minimal amount of educational support. In fact, this picture here is one of my classrooms that I had 3 courses that I took while attending Brigham Young University back in the 1980s. In fact, I took 2 geology courses in there and a microbiology course. And if you look at the educational support, it was pretty minimal. You would go to a lecture a couple times a week. You would always have a textbook, and if you needed any help, you would go talk to the professor during office hours. A lot of this was based on that students would create their own strategies for study and their own study plans. We've changed this a lot since that time. And let me show you an example of the educational support that we usually have in traditional classes. The typical college courses, now that we have things like Blackboard and Canvas, have copies for the students for all kinds of things, since we now mostly teach using PowerPoints, so we often have copies of PowerPoints with things like Screencast-O-Matic, Integrity. We now often go and record a lot of our lectures. We often, because of YouTube and other sources, we can often go in and put supplemental videos online that students can actually go and watch. We still have students buy textbooks. Textbooks have changed a lot. There are a lot more questions that are embedded within them. We often have other little online support materials. We often give a lot more quizzes. Some classes will actually go and help students prepare for exams by giving them a study guide or having review lectures prior to a test. Again, office hours for a faculty member like me, it's usually about 8 to 10 hours a week. And we often have tutoring centers for helping students with math and science and oftentimes English. Even though we have a lot of these supplemental and support systems for students, I still get the same types of questions. Let me show you one. This is often a question that I get, is what is the best way to study for your tests? I've been thinking about this question for a long time. In fact, it sort of got me onto this path about how learning works. And if we sort of dissect that question, it really comes down to something a little bit more specific. How do I succeed in your course? And then I thought about this, success in a course, and then I often think about those questions here, and sometimes it comes down to something a little bit more desperate. How do I learn all this stuff? All right. Given that we have a huge number of resources that students are have available to students, sometimes we forget that they might be overwhelmed by thinking, wow, look at all that stuff. And they want to narrow it down to say, okay, what works? What's the best way to go and do that? This actually is what led me to doing some research on my own on the best ways to learn, best ways to study for a course. When I would have students who would ask me these same questions. And so I started doing some research, and I discovered some remarkable answers to those questions. I want to begin by that they're actually a group of researchers who specialize in this and trying to figure out the best ways to study and how we learn and the best ways to learn. They're called educational psychologists, and they have made some wonderful discoveries about this particular process. Early in my research and looking at educational psychologists, I found one that I really liked, and I've read several of his books. His name is Daniel T. Willingham. He's a psychology professor at the University of Virginia, and this was one of the first books that I read in my journey, called Why Don't Students Like School? And I just thought it was a wonderful book, and it has some fantastic insights, and I want to share some of his insights. One that has stuck with me for these years is actually going and looking at just a simple definition, and it's the definition of what learning is. So here is Daniel Willingham's definition of learning. Learning is forming long-term memories for a rapid retrieval over a lifetime. Let me repeat that. Learning is forming long-term memories for rapid retrieval over a lifetime. Now, what learning is not is learning enough to pass the test the next day, or learning that lasts long enough to pass the midterm in a month, or learning to pass a final in a couple of months. Learning is forming long-term memories for a lifetime. That one definition there has revolutionized my approach to teaching. Now, that's a pretty high standard for what we do. If we're educators and we're trying to teach and we're trying to help people learn, that goal is incredibly high. So if we have real learning in our schools and real learning in our classes and courses, all right, we're really looking for something that's going to be permanent, for something that's going to last somebody for a lifetime. That is incredibly heavy, and that is a very, very lofty goal. Now, I teach biology, and recently I've been teaching a lot of anatomy and physiology, and this is something that my students confront. Pictures like this with zillions of different parts. Here's all the muscles of the face and neck. Here are some of the major blood vessels of the head and neck. Here's the nerves of the head and neck. We have some glands there. We have parts of the larynx. That can be absolutely overwhelming. All right? And if we want our students to really learn something, all right, they should be able to remember this years later. That's a high order. So, if we think about the definition of learning, if the goal of education is forming long-term memories, maybe a solution to that is limiting the amount of information that we're trying to teach. Maybe the best way to do it is to limit the depth of coverage. Maybe less really is more. Now, one thing that I learned from Dr. Willingham is this, is that one of our goals of education, one of our goals of specifically a college education, is not only to go and get some background knowledge, it's also to learn to reason logically, and it's also learn to think critically and problem solve. Turns out that those three things, all right, background knowledge, logical reasoning, and critical thinking, all depend on each other. You can't have one without the other. If you think about experts, experts really know their subject well. They have an extensive background knowledge that enables them to problem solve and to think well and reason well. So you can't have one without the other. Now, a few years ago, I read this book called Academically Adrift. This caused quite a stir within college circles, with the conclusion that based on a lot of assessments, they found that students with their level of critical thinking and logical reasoning were entering college and then leaving college with the same level, that there wasn't any difference or increase in the level of critical thinking or logical reasoning. That's pretty remarkable. That shows that we have a systematic failure within a college education and a college curriculum. Wow, that's pretty dire. Now, just this last year, I discovered a new educational psychologist. This is Carol Dweck. Professor Dweck teaches at Stanford, and she has written a wonderful book called Mindset. And she mentioned some really interesting things about what we've been talking about. And I want to actually go and show that one. As I mentioned before, one particular thing is that maybe less is more. Maybe we should just teach a few things, but something that will last a long time. In fact, she addresses this question in her book. She says, many educators think that lowering their standards will give students success experience, boost their self-esteem, and raise their achievement. Right? So when we think about watered-down versions of a class, that's oftentimes the rationale for it. But let's see what she says to this. She says, well, it doesn't work. Lowering standards just leads to poorly educated students who feel entitled to easy work and lavish praise. So this backfires. It really does. But it also leads us back to the same problem. And let me show you what I mean by that. We're on a razor's edge when it comes to balancing this challenge of learning a lot of background knowledge and at the same time keeping kids in school. This is another part of her argument here. She says, on the other hand, simply raising standards in our schools without giving students the means of reaching them is a recipe for disaster. It just pushes the poorly prepared or poorly motivated students into failure and out of school. Wow. So it leads us to this particular question. Is there a way to set high standards and have students reach them? Wow. Now, luckily, I discovered a way to do it. And it comes from another set of educational psychologists, this time from St. Louis, Missouri. Henry Rediger and Mark McDaniel are both educational psychology professors at Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri, and they wrote a wonderful book called Make It Stick: The Science of Successful Learning. Now, if we think about the definition of learning, is that forming long-term memories for rapid retrieval over a lifetime. When it really comes down to it, we're actually going and taking this information and putting it in long-term memory from short-term memory. Now, psychologists have known for a long time that in order to do that, we have to rehearse the material often. We often have a couple of names for that. I like to call it practice. Sometimes people will call it study. Some people will call it rehearsal. All right, whatever floats your boat. All right. So if you think about it, if we're going to want to remember something for the long term, we have to practice a lot, all right, to go and get that into long-term memory. Now, it turns out that we have two types of rehearsal. Learning requires practice. One is what we call elaborative rehearsal. All right. This is integration of new information into what the person already knows. All right. In psychology and in education, we often call this constructivism. All right. We just go and connect, all right, new knowledge to pre-existing knowledge, sort of like building a scaffold, all right, or building an edifice. All right. One of the things I tell my students, especially if I hear someone say, why do I have to learn this? Or why do we have to know this? All right. I tell them to be selfish, because since knowledge is based on knowing things, and the bigger scaffold you have, the easier it is to learn something new. All right? The more you know, the easier it is to learn something new. This is the reason why the more you know, the easier it is to learn something new. This constructivism. All right? So why shortchange yourself? You never know how that's going to help you in the future. So I often tell them, be selfish. Learn as much as you can. The other part of this is maintenance rehearsal. One of the big things that our brain has to do is our brains are very dynamic. They're constantly strengthening and weakening synapses or forming new synapses when we get new information. And we have to strengthen those retrieval pathways in order to go and help keep that memory there for the long term. And the other thing too is we have to keep it accessible. All right. Remember, part of the definition of learning is rapid retrieval. All right. So that it's just going to be at our fingertips. It's going to be on the tip of our tongue, that we can retrieve it easily. So a lot of rehearsal that's required to learn something. Now, if we look at how college is set up and how our courses are set up and how our curriculum is set up, a good question is, who in college is the best at doing this for students? You might be surprised by the answer. Turns out, who is the best at doing this turns out to be coaches, athletic coaches. Now, even though sports and athletics are at odds with academia, all right, and academics in colleges and things like that, in high schools and things like that, we find that they are a fantastic template or model to follow when we have to learn something. Let me demonstrate by that. All right. If you think about college athletics, all right, athletes spend a lot of time just in practice. In fact, here at my little community college, all right, During the year, athletes are practicing daily, all right, Monday through Friday, all right, sometimes on the weekends, all right, and they're practicing a couple hours every day. We have a name for this in educational psychology. We call this distributed practice, as opposed to massed practice, which occurs, we call cramming right before a test. All right. Imagine how good University of Alabama football would be if they would just cram the Friday night before their games on Saturday. They would not do very well. So coaches learned a long time that in order to learn, you have to have distributed practice, regular practice. The second thing is oftentimes when you go and you watch a practice, you'll notice that they do a lot of fundamentals. All right? They rehearse skills that they had learned maybe even as kids. All right? So daily review of fundamentals. The other really important thing they do, and this is absolutely fantastic, and I got this from Making It Stick, is that it turns out that the best way to study, I'll come back to that one, is to actually go and follow this one. Practice how you play. All right. The more you can replicate the conditions of an actual game during practice, the better prepared you'll be in the real event. All right. So oftentimes when you go and you watch a practice, they will try to simulate as closely as possible the real event. It may be a little practice game. It may be going and hitting flies out to the outfield, or in basketball or football having a scrimmage. All right? Trying to replicate as closely as they can to the actual event. You may also notice that lots of times there's solo practice that takes place out there. I happen to live right behind a batting cage next to campus, and I can't tell you how many nights at about 9 or 10 o'clock I hear ting, 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 as athletes are out there practicing their batting, practicing their hitting on their own. So wouldn't that be great for our students to go and have the same opportunity as athletes do? All right. Imagine how successful our students would be if they had the same regimen as athletes do, that they would have a daily practice. Now, you can imagine, for example, in our college we have 4 days of classes, Monday through Thursday, and then for example, our athletes, for example, will actually go and have practice 3 hours a day from 2 to 5, and then Friday morning from 9 to noon. So if you count that up, that's 15 hours of coach practice every week. All right? That's pretty remarkable. Imagine our students having the same level of practice. All right? That would just be amazing for what our students would be able to do to study. Now, we have a slightly different system, all right, in the classroom. All right. For example, most of our classes are 75 minutes. That's an hour and 15 minutes. And most of that time we're spending lecture. All right. The state gives us a certain amount of material that we are expected to cover throughout a semester. And for me, I am incredibly lucky to be able to get through all the material that I'm supposed to cover. I hate to say it, but there are some things that I never get to that I would love to get to. And 75 minutes twice a week is not enough time to do that. All right. Now, I do have colleagues who actually go and they may cover one topic one day. And once they finish that topic, then they let their classes go early. That extra time, that 5, 10, sometimes even 15 minutes, is a perfect opportunity for in-class practice. And I might do a whole little separate talk just about that. So we have a cultural norm in college and in education. That means that students don't have coach practice. Right? Students, unlike athletic programs, are expected just to go and study outside of class. I think that this is one of the biggest obstacles to learning in school. Right? I am so envious of athletic programs that they have that much time and resources to actually go and help students practice. Right? Imagine what athletics would look like if it had to do what we expect students to do in regular academic courses. Right? Now, in order to go and study successfully outside of class, students require a huge amount of self-discipline. I have sort of come up with a formula for successful learning, and it basically is a combination of 3 things. All right. Number 1, which is what we call the growth mindset, when it's a nutshell, basically that I'm able to learn something. All right. That I can learn something. All right. That our minds can change. All right. That's pretty basic, but that's the idea behind it. Now, believe it or not, there are a lot of people who just say, no, I can't do that. All right. No, I'm just dumb. I can't do that. No. That's called the fixed mindset, and growth mindset is a big difference to that. Second one, effective study strategies. That's huge, and that's what a lot of Making It Stick talks about. And the third one is effort. All right, making the time, actually going and sitting down to do that. All right, those 3 are absolutely necessary for learning to take place. Right? And for students to be able to go and have those 3 things all working together at the same time is sometimes really difficult. So let me show you 2 ways that I have come up with for my own courses on ways to help students practice in class. And I'm going to show you 2 ways I've done it. One is by revising assessments, and the second one is just a simple little thing about showing and focusing on the best ways to study, what I call study plans. Now, I'm really lucky since I teach a science course. Science courses do have practice sessions, and we call them lab periods. Here in my college, we have lab time twice a week for an hour. So I have about 2 hours that I can assess for practice time, and I'm very grateful for that. I feel bad for my colleagues in other divisions, English and math and all those other ones where they don't have a practice period. In addition to general in-lab practice activities, the traditional lab activities, I have expanded practice into assessments. Now, if you remember, we have found out that the best way to practice is 3 things. Number 1, a little bit every day. All right, so regular practice, that's what distributed means. All right, so rather than just cramming for a test, and that's the only time that you practice, all right, we've got to do it regularly. That's what distributed means. Number 2, all right, comprehensive. That means that we go back in time. All right. One of the saddest things that I remember seeing as a teacher is going and having an exam And then after the exam, students would come, raise their hand and said, well, are we going to cover any of that stuff before? Are we going to be, no, here's the question, the thing they said. Are we going to be tested on anything that we just learned? And this was after the exam. And I said, well, I don't think so. And they said, good. And they would just take out all their notes from the stuff that we covered previously and threw them away. And that just absolutely killed me. Remember, if we're going to keep something in long-term memory, we have to practice it. All right. So a great way to do that is to keep those retrieval pathways open. That maintenance rehearsal is to have something that's comprehensive. The other thing too is that thing that we learn from athletics. Practice how you play. Right? So if you think about in academia, what the big event is, what the game is, it's being asked questions. If we think about our assessments, thinking about quizzes and exams and those kinds of things, those tests, all those are the big events in academia. So we're trying to figure out what you know. So in order to do that, if you think about what our big event is, it's those tests. All right? So a great way to practice is to practice answering questions, practice taking tests, practice by taking quizzes. All right? So those are my big three. So in the past, all right, when I taught anatomy and physiology for years, this was my sequence. A lot of anatomy is learning parts of the body, so I would have three big practicals. A practical basically is a whole bunch of bones, for example, out on the counter. It would have a little question next to it. Name this bone, name this muscle, name this tissue, name this hole, name this bump. All right, and they would write it out. And for an A&P class, I would basically have three practicals, each one worth about 10% of their grade. After about the first month of class, we would have a bone practical, the bones of the skeleton. About a month later, we would have one on the tissues and the skin. And then near the end of the course, we would have the muscles of the body. All right. Then we would have, throughout the semester, we would have exams. So we would have basically 3 exams, and then I would just have a little simple comprehensive terms test at the end, kind of as a way to have something that's comprehensive but not very scary. All right. So this is how I would do it. There are some pedagogical problems with this particular approach to assessments. Number one, you might notice that they basically have 3 big tests. They have a bone test, a tissue and skin test, and a muscle test, plus 3 big exams. That's a lot of risk. All right. If you look particularly at something like their exams, that's a big part of their grade. Each one counts a lot. All right, each practical counts a lot. The big thing about this is this system also encourages cramming. All right, they may study like crazy. The other big thing too is if you go and you take a look, for example, at let's say exam 1, you're covering 4 chapters. Now, given that your exam day, which you usually take an entire period, so let's say that you have an hour or hour and 15 minutes. And if you look at a typical student, all right, you might have, for example, I used to have maybe 80 questions. Now, if you think about 80 questions, all right, that means you can only ask 20 questions on each of those material. And if you look at the length of those chapters, some of them are huge. The skeleton is gigantic. Right? So you really end up limiting your coverage. All right? The depth of the testing is sometimes pretty superficial, especially when you have a lot to cover. The other problem too is, you go into exam 2, there's no questions from the previous material. That's awful. All right. If you really want to go and have learning, all right, you need to keep those pathways open. All right. You want them to know it all by the end of the semester. So it's not comprehensive. All right. That's a big problem. That's why they end up taking your first section notes and throwing them in the trash can because they don't think they'll ever need it again. That's not really learning. One of the things that we forget as educators is that one fantastic learning activity and learning tool are quizzes and exams. All right? Sometimes we forget about them, but you can learn a lot about the material and about what you know and what you don't know, and your mastery of the subject by actually going and taking them. So in and of itself, intrinsically, these assessments are wonderful learning tools. The other problem too, I don't know about you, but I often have way too much material and too few days to actually go and cover it all. So when you go and give an exam, you're losing a lecture day. That's a lot of time. And the other big problem is makeup exams. I mean, I always hated trying to chase around students to go and take makeups. And sometimes you'll have sneaky Pete's who will actually go and, they'll purposely skip an exam because they figure that the makeups will be easier. All right, they'll have more time to study for it. It's not really fair. So that's a problem too. So I've been thinking about my assessments a lot, and I've changed them, trying to address that question. All right, what good are they? Practice how you pray. Something that's distributive and something that's comprehensive. All right. So this is what I've done. Instead of having just 3 big practicals, now I just have one every week. Now, our typical course lasts 15 weeks. So throughout the semester, we might have 13 or 14 assessment weeks. All right. So every Monday, I have a little practical. All right. It's really small. It's 15 questions. I usually have 15 specimens. All right. It typically takes about 15 minutes. So if I have an hour and 15 minutes twice a week, that works out great. So we can knock it out in 15 or 20 minutes. Sometimes it might be a little bit longer, but usually not. I have 10 new specimens from stuff that we've learned previously, and then 5 specimens from previous stuff. So by the time we get to the end of the semester, we might have specimens that we saw the first week. And that's great for that long-term memory. Instead of having 3 big exams, now I do a weekly quiz. Thank goodness I have an hour a day for lab. So 1 hour during the week we spend on actually going and having a quiz. And it's 50 questions. 40 questions are on recent material, 10 questions from past material. And I do something a little bit different, and I am going to make a little video just about how I do what we call a group quiz. So the students actually go and take it twice. They first take it by themselves. So they do a solo effort, all right? And then early in the semester, I divide them up into groups. These are groups probably between 4 and 6 students. All right, they're permanent groups, so they're with the same students throughout the semester. But after everyone finishes with the solo quiz, then I give the same quiz, just a single copy, to each group, and they take the quiz as a group. And so the students, which is great, get to see it again. They get to discuss it with their group. They get a little quiz grade from both the solo, which is most of it, about 55%. About 5% is their group quiz grade. Then they turn it in. I grade all their group quizzes. So usually I just have 4 groups. I just have to grade 4 quizzes really quick. I post the scores on the board, and then I give them back their group quizzes so they can look at it. By the end, they know what they got, pretty much, and they have gone over the material. If you look at it, they've gone over the material 3 times, which is fantastic. And they know how they did, and I don't get the big demand for, I need to know my grade right now, which sometimes that you get with regular thing. And I've used this process for a long time, and I find a lot of success with it. At the end of the semester, I do what's called a comprehensive terms test. All right, a comprehensive terms test is fantastic. I got it from a colleague of mine. Throughout the semester, every unit that we cover, I hand out a little sheet that has all these terms. A lot of about learning is learning new vocabulary. And with these comprehensive terms, basically, by the end of the semester, students will have learned close to 400 to 500 new vocabulary terms. A lot of mastering material is just learning the new vocabulary. And what I do at the end of the semester is I just go and have a random number generator that picks out 75 of those 500, let's say, that span the length of the course. And then I just have a matching quiz. And I usually make it about 5% of their grade, so it's a low-risk quiz, but it's a way for me to be comprehensive in addition to the comprehensive portions that are found on the practicals and weekly quizzes. So with this one, it solves some of those pedagogical problems that I had with the previous stuff. The quizzes are low risk. They're low risk because they're going to take 13, 14 of them. They're low risk because I dropped the lowest 3. That accounts for absences. If they're absent because of something, because of a sickness, because of a car breaking down, because of another obligation, court, all right, I just drop the lowest 3. That way I don't have to worry about makeups, which is really, really important. I do only do makeups, and this only happens occasionally if I have some athlete that has a game or something like that. And I would, and usually it doesn't happen very often. So, but I don't have to worry about makeups with this, because I am actually going and having weekly quizzes, and they're 50 questions a piece or 15 questions a piece every week. I can go into a lot more depth on the material, which is helpful for everybody. Of course, these are comprehensive. This is a fantastic way to practice. Since I do this every week and I can use my labs, this gives me no lost teaching days. So I can have an hour and 15 minutes for lecture every twice a week, which is perfect. So I get to cover as much material as I need to cover. So, unlike science, where we do have some lab time, what about if you teach a course where you don't have time for frequent assessments? Well, I have a solution for this. All right. One of the benefits I had for going to Brigham Young University is that Brigham Young University has a testing center. Now, not all professors use this, but I had professors, particularly in large sections and large classes, who would make use of that. And I just have thought this was a great idea for years and years, and I'm not sure why this is not more common in other colleges and universities. This is a great solution, and I think it really needs to be adopted. If you had a testing center, you could do exactly the same thing. So instead of going and taking time from lecture, students could on their own time, actually go and take more assessments. So instead of having a couple big exams where you take off lecture time for those, you could increase the number and increase the depth of those assessments, and you wouldn't lose class time for that. So they could actually go and do that at these large testing centers. This would actually give them some distributed practice. This would give them greater depth. You could make them comprehensive. In and of itself, just like we saw before, it's an effective practice activity. No lost teaching days. And how these testing centers work is you say, okay, this test will be available for 2 days, let's say, or maybe 3 days. So if you had students who were sick or had a sick child or any other little excuse that sometimes and problems pick up, they would still have time to go and take it. So it reduces the amount of makeups to a insignificant level. So I think it's great. There are some drawbacks to it. It's not a perfect solution. Number one of the big things that I love are group quizzes, but I would be willing to give up a group quiz to actually go and have a testing center. The other big problem is sometimes students, because of work schedules and family concerns, don't have a lot of time outside of class. So you've got to have a testing center where they can go. And I have found that with my 50-question quizzes, most students are done within 20 to 30 minutes. And as long as they don't have to wait a lot at a testing center, I think that's very doable. The other thing, too, is you need a place on campus. And I don't know about your school, but we are at a space is a premium, and we don't have a place right now where we could actually go and have a testing center. The other thing, this would cost money. So to have somebody who in charge of this with staffing and proctors and a security system, this would be a problem. But it is a great solution to the problems of having frequent quizzes and exams. It would also solve very easily the makeup problem. So if that's a problem in your neck of the woods, a testing center is a great solution. So we come back to the next question, is what is the best way to study for your test? That was the original question that my students would ask me. Well, the second way that I actually have addressed that is to come up with a daily study plan. Given that our students have access to all kinds of educational support, especially through things like Canvas and Blackboard today, and tutoring centers and all this additional information, what is the best way to study for those weekly quizzes or for those weekly practicals that I have? So what I started doing is what I call a study plan. And let me show you one from one of my anatomy classes. All right. I simply just write this on our dry erase board every time. All right. So in this case, for example, you can see that they know what's coming up, that they have a quiz on Tuesday. So this is a Thursday class. What it's going to be covering, that quiz is going to be covering second part of respiratory system. All right. I usually divide the study plan into 2 sections. One, I think the textbooks are excellent. They're often much better than what I can do explaining the material. I follow the textbooks very closely. I would say that for most of my classes, about 95% of what I cover is covered in the textbook. So I think textbooks are excellent. I think students can get a lot of information and a lot of nuance and detail that we can't cover, particularly in lecture, from reading the material. So I give them the sections that I'd like them to read. The second part, all right, is the retrieval practice. All right. We often find that students, and 80% of students do this, one terrible way to study is just to go and reread and reread and reread the notes or the text. Turns out that only works for about the first 2 times. It leads to the delusion, or what we call the illusion of knowledge, which basically means that you feel like you're familiar with it, but the problem is you don't really know it. All right. And it's a terrible, terrible way to actually go and study. So remember, our goal in the study is to practice how we play. So the best way to study is to replicate the conditions of a quiz or an exam, which means to answer questions. And so I am a big fan of retrieval practice. That turns out to be the best way to study, is what we call retrieval practice. And in that case, what I have is a whole series of retrieval practice questions on an online platform called Quizlet. I absolutely love Quizlet. So as you can see there, I have a whole series of review questions, some practice questions that are found on Quizlet. And if you've never experienced Quizlet, it is magnificent. And I wish I had this when I was a student. So the most effective way to practice is retrieval practice. And here's a great little picture. When I was a student years ago, there were certain classes where I actually sat down and wrote out 3x5 cards, and I would write a question on one side and the answer on the other, and I would just go through them constantly. That's a fantastic way. We call them flashcards. All right. And I've done this for years, unknowing that this is a fantastic way, one of the best ways to study. So this is actually a little picture showing you my Quizlet. This actually comes from 201. For my students, if they have a practical coming up, I actually go and have taken pictures of all the specimens, put a little pointer on the part they need to know, and they have a whole series. You can see on the skeleton, we learn over 100 different parts of the skeleton, and so I have hundreds of different pictures with the little parts thing so they can review the specimens on their phone. Quizlet is available as an app on their phone. Here's one for the human tissues. Here's one for the skin. Here's one for all the muscles of the body. So this is something that they can practice at home. So for example, let's say we go and we take a look at the muscles of the body. Here's a little model there. You might see something like this on a practical with a real model there. And have a little pointer there, say, what muscle is this? And they look at it, and if they know it, they'll say, zygomaticus. So, and the cool thing about it is you'll notice there's a little star in the upper right-hand corner. If there's one they don't know, they can click on that, all right? And they can come back and review the ones they don't know. You also notice that down here on the bottom left is a thing called shuffle. And this is great because they can shuffle that and they don't know what's coming. And so instead of there's a whole level of complexity when you don't know what's coming next. That's absolutely fantastic. It's called oh, I can't remember the name of it right now, but there is a way to actually go and do that. So if you shuffle things, it's a great way to learn. It's a whole nother level of mastery. For the other ones, if they want to study for a quiz, for example, we're looking at some of the ones that I do for my A&P2 class. You can see I have 600 retrieval questions on blood, digestive system, endocrine system, the heart, the lymphatic system. These are fantastic. This is a great way for students to learn. It's a great way to study. In fact, as a biologist, and sometimes I might not cover these, once or twice a year. So this is how I do maintenance rehearsal for myself. So oftentimes, instead of going and looking over my notes before I give a lecture, I will actually go, and maybe the day before, I'll sit there and go through a Quizlet. And if there's parts that I don't remember, fantastic. This gives me some maintenance rehearsal and some elaboration rehearsal so that I can do this. So if you want your students to actually go and practice, this is a fantastic way to do it. And students have been doing Quizlet at least in high school. So most of my students have experience with this, and some of them actually go and write their own. I don't really do a lot of Quizlets for the terms, for the comprehensive terms test, and a lot of my students have gone and done it for themselves and for their friends. So if we're going to go and do this, if you want to help your students practice for their exams and quizzes, this is a fantastic way to do it. So I would encourage you to write thousands and thousands and thousands of these. I've done this for most of my courses. They're not exactly 100% complete, and I do have errors. Students will let you know if there is indeed an error in there. They will let you know, and so that you can actually go and fix it. So this is a fantastic resource. Here's another little example from my blood Quizlet. A Quizlet on blood. A clot that persists in an unbroken blood vessel is known, and if they know it, they say, oh, well, that's a thrombus, and it's indeed a thrombus. Now, I would strongly encourage you, if you haven't done this for your classes, to actually go and do this. This is a fantastic study material. So if you think about those two important things, that you want students to have a study plan, I think the textbooks are wonderful. It's a great way to do it, plus your notes. So reading is great. And the second thing is retrieval practice. When you write these things, I've learned a few things from actually going and doing these Quizlet questions. I do like fill in the blank. All right. What we really want them to know is no vocabulary. I'm also a big stickler for spelling, particularly when it comes to the practicals. I want them to know it inside and out. And so this is a great way to do that. Number two, you want to keep the answers short. You don't want to go and have them having to reel off some big, long definition. If you do have something like a definition, oftentimes I will go and break it down into sections and have multiple questions that will ask about the different sections. So you don't want your answers to be too long, because that's really tough to remember. But if you do it and break it down into certain segments, that helps a lot. Rephrase questions. This is a very, very big one. Oftentimes students, especially among the first quizzes and things, I've had students in the past say, well, that wasn't the definition I learned. You know, one of the big things, the big step, is to get away from the verbatim. And we see that all the time in high schools, that sometimes, you know, they have been trained that they have to have it exactly the way that the textbook has it, and that's just basic factual knowledge. It needs to be upgraded, that they can actually go and see that the concept can be rephrased in a variety of ways, and so you don't just get that rote memorization. The other big thing, keep it broad. Lots and lots of depth to it. You want to go and be able to cover everything. Oftentimes I'll sit there and cover lots of things, and make sure that it covers everything that you cover in your lectures. So it's not just one point to it. Sometimes if you look at test banks, they may skip sections, or they might just have one or two questions on one thing and a zillion questions on another. You need to spread that out, and you need to go and get them equally covered. Go deep. That's so important. Details are really, really important. You know, oftentimes when you're stuck just giving a few tests and you're limited to the number of questions that you have, sometimes you end up just being really superficial. This is a great way. The other big thing, and I've particularly found this useful, is that oftentimes you might notice, for example, my blood was section was 600 questions. Oftentimes textbooks are broken up into segments and sections. It is so much easier for students, especially if they want to shuffle something, to go and divide them into sections. So I think if I would do it again, that's exactly what I would do. I would break them up into segments, and I've done that for chemistry. I sat in on a chemistry class, and I started doing entire chapters on Quizlets, and I would get a couple hundred questions. And then I kept thinking, oh, this is so much easier if I just did it by section, and it makes a big, big difference. Writing Quizlet questions takes a long time. I did most of mine during the summer, lots of times at night, sitting in my little comfy chair with my computer and with the textbook open, with my lecture notes open, and writing as many as I possibly can. However, students, I can't tell you how important this is. This is a fantastic, probably the best way for students to learn the material and prepare for quizzes. So I would strongly encourage you to do that. As I mentioned before, a lot of my courses, for example, A and P2, is always, I joke with my students, I say, that kicks my butt too. It's some really complicated material, and this is a way for me to do a refresher, and so I often use it for my little prep. The other thing too is, remember, on my quizzes and on my practicals, I often go and do past material. For the quizzes, this is where I get my questions. I just simply go, and there's that shuffle thing. I just hit shuffle on a little unit, and I just go, and that's where the questions come from. So I just use and just use old Quizlet questions, which makes it really simple to actually go and come up with some fantastic reviews. So that's how I do it. All right, well, hopefully you got something out of that. I am going to go and add a few more things to some separate questions, separate things on this particular one, a little bit more about group quizzes and things you can do after, if you after you've done a lecture and you still have time left over. Certain types of activities that you can do for that maintenance rehearsal for your students. All right. Thank you.